Well, good afternoon, everyone, at least from European time. Very warm welcome to you all. This is Martin Lush from NSF, presenting our September edition, Where Has the Year Gone, of our free webinars series. So the subject for this one is training, how to make the subject matter, how to make that information stick. In other words, it doesn't stay in the classroom, it actually moves out of the classroom and starts to influence the behaviors in the workplace. This is the, as I said, September. This is obviously just one of a range of subjects that we've covered this year, and thank you very much for all your positive feedback on these. So the subject is training, how to make the material stick. And for those of you that have participated in these webinars before, the usual, these are short and sharp, 30 minutes long. They are recorded, and I would really encourage you to share those recordings, share the links that you will receive at the end of this session, because as an industry, we must, for the survival of our businesses and our industry, completely change the way we approach training and education. All questions will be answered. I can't answer them during the session, ladies and gentlemen, but as many of you know, I do get back to you personally. I will respond to any question that you have, and hopefully there will be plenty after this session. I'm always disappointed when there's no questions. Please feedback. It's the only way that we improve these sessions is by taking your feedback and using that feedback to improve. And please follow me on LinkedIn. I try to do as many posts as I can that are thought-provoking and helpful and get you to think about things in a very, very different way. For those of you that don't know me, I'm Martin Lush. I'm the Global VP for NSF Health Sciences. Amongst other things, in my 40 years, I've done a lot of education with as we used to be David Begg Associates and now NSF Health Sciences. So I've been at this for 40 years across 5 different continents and many, many different cultures. And I'm still a student of learning. I've always been fascinated by the process of how information is retained and how that information is used, because that's the whole purpose of any training and education program, is to not transfer knowledge, but it's to change the way people think, so that the behaviors in the workplace change. And I've been long fascinated by that, and I continue to learn about the process of learning as research develops and we start to understand more about how the brain works. As an appetizer to this session, ladies and gentlemen, the world that we live in, I love this term, we live in a VUCA world, a world that is volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous, and this is the new norm. So, you know, for those of us who like or for those of anybody, in fact, who like a steady ride, those days are long gone. That picture on the left-hand side really, for me, symbolizes the world that we now live in with all of the uncertainty and all of the opportunity that uncertainty provides, providing we have a workforce from top to bottom with the agility in thinking skills, in problem-solving skills, and in knowledge to make a real difference when we have the volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity that is now the norm. And I say to my children, look, just accept a few things. Life is unfair. The goalposts always change, and nothing is certain. And that's not me being negative. It's just being realistic. And it's really saying to people, look, in order to really prosper and thrive and enjoy this VUCA world, we actually need a different skill set. We need different knowledge and a different way of utilizing that knowledge, because this is the new norm. And organizations that succeed, well, success looks like this. Successful organizations will utilize fully the intellectual property of their entire workforce. I've gone on record as saying most companies, in my opinion, use only 3 to 4% of the intellectual capability of their entire workforce. And people say to me, well, where do you get that information from, Martin? And I say, look, it's a guesstimate based upon the answers I get to one question I ask everybody I meet in the industry, and that is, what did you do over the weekend? And it's quite fascinating. You find people have really invested their time and effort into doing really challenging things, whether it be, running sports clubs, youth clubs, doing self-study, MBAs. They do all of this in their own time. And to me, that's a real illustration that from the warehouse operator, the analyst, people throughout the organization have a level of mental capacity and intellectual capacity that we only scratch the surface of. And the successful organizations in this volatile, uncertain, complex, and ambiguous world will only be those companies who free up and utilize that intellectual capacity. Success also will be down to those who can solve problems very, very quickly, who use the combined intellect of their entire workforce, not just of their middle or senior management, but of their entire workforce from top to bottom. Because that's where the creative solutions actually come from. And success is really about moving from that really traditional hierarchy, that traditional levels of bureaucracy, that top-down approach, to a more fast-moving, dynamic, interlinked organizations that many of you will identify with, because many of your companies are moving to that kind of flexible, fast-moving, fast-thinking structure. Because that hierarchy on the left, those days are gone. That's too slow, it's too bureaucratic, and people at the bottom of the pyramid, who, in my opinion, actually add far more value in many respects, are not utilized to their full capacity. So in order to move from one to the other, we need an educated workforce. And we use these terms, education and training, as if they're the same. Well, as NSF, we see them very, very differently. We describe training as that you train your pets, you educate your children, and there's a profound difference in those approaches. And we really need to be honest, and we need to be real when we look at the way, and I know I'm generalizing here, ladies and gentlemen, because I know many of you will be adopting good practices. So I also know that many are not, because we need to be really, really honest that the traditional approaches that we've used in the past have failed. The death by PowerPoint, the traditional classroom, the read the SOP and understand, the tutor doing more talking than the participants. We know all of this fails in that it does not succeed in changing the way people think. Levels of retention are usually low, and ultimately there's no return on investment because behavior stays the same, because the learning stays in the classroom. And we also know that that validation, so-called, that we do at the end of any training session, which is usually a tick box exercise, is no measure whatsoever of the effectiveness of that training. It's just a measure of short-term memory. What we also know what we also know, and this is very well published research, is that using that traditional classroom PowerPoint tutor doing the talking approach is actually in many respects a waste of time, because most of that information, most of that knowledge is forgotten very, very quickly. Not only is it a waste of time, ladies and gentlemen, I actually think that traditional, what I call tick box approach to training, is actually very dangerous. And this is training done for compliance. So many companies I go to, you ask the question, what is the purpose of your training program? So often the response I get back is, well, it's a regulatory requirement. And of course it is, but what the regulators want is an educational training program that is effective in conveying the important knowledge to people to enable them to do their job to the best of their capability. I say it's dangerous because it does give the illusion that we have a trained workforce capable of doing what they need to do to manufacture product that is safe, of the right quality and effective. So when senior leaders look at the measures for training, what they see largely are boxes ticked, the programs complete, but in fact the level of understanding at the workplace often is really, really poor. So it gives the illusion of we have a trained and educated workforce, but in fact the opposite is very, very true. So please remember the difference between education and training. We train our pets, we educate our children. Please also remember, and I know we all know this, but our products are only as good as our people, and we have to first make our people through our education programs before we can make our products. Without making our people, we cannot make products. And I think in the pharmaceutical industry, I think we have we're all, most of us at least, from a science background, and I think we have this perception that when you have a degree or an MSc or a PhD, you are educated. I tend to disagree. I think that shows those qualifications show a level of understanding in a particular subject, not necessarily having the tools and techniques and understanding to succeed in the pharmaceutical industry. So we employ people thinking that they are educated, if you like, they are the finished article, and therefore we have to do very little else with them. I think that is fundamentally wrong. I think the pharmaceutical industry is no different to any others. We need to make people before we are able to make our products. And education, and I'm not going to use the word training, again, I'm going to really focus on education. Education looks like this, and the case study I'm going to present, ladies and gentlemen, shows how this, what we call 10-20-70 model, actually works. I'm going to give you a case study to illustrate that so that you can have some real practical tools and techniques to go away and use. So stickability, that is making information stick to enable people to use that in the workplace to the benefit of the organization and ultimately the benefit of the patient. It looks like this. It's the 10%, and this reflects the amount of time that we spend in each. The 10% of our time is conveying the must know. In other words, this is really through structured programs of education, if you like, what we typically associate with the classroom. The 20% represents immediate practice and application. So once we've conveyed the must know, that is immediately followed up with a practical exercise, a case study, a problem solving, a discussion exercise, in order to consolidate that learning pattern in the brain. Now, it's really, really important that this is done immediately, because just conveying knowledge does create the very early formation of a learning pathway in the brain, but it's very, very fragile, and unless that's consolidated or strengthened by application, it disappears very, very quickly. But as you can see, the bulk of the learning, the real learning, is actually learning in the workplace. So what I want to do, ladies and gentlemen, is to give you a case study just to illustrate this so that you can, and as I work through this, I really want you to consider your own programs and what you do under the 10%, the 20%, and the 70%. And I'm going to give you an illustration here. It is for those of you in sterile product manufacture, you will identify with this case study, you will understand the terminology. For those of you that are not, hopefully I will explain well enough for you to really understand the context as well as the application. So this case study was probably about a year and a half ago, ladies and gentlemen. I visited the company. I was actually doing an audit. I walked into the autoclave unloading area. This is where components following sterilization with moist heat through an autoclave, which is basically a pressure cooker, The loads are taken out of the autoclave and they're stored ready for use. And in this case, it was in an aseptic manufacturing process. Now, I just looked at the training records of the operators, and they all indicated that very typical learning by SOP, learning by death by PowerPoint approach. So I immediately knew that they probably didn't understand the why that underpinned the how. Immediately walked into the autoclave unloading area and saw a load that was wet. Now, a wet load, ladies and gentlemen, is indicative of a major equipment failure. Either the autoclave has been loaded inappropriately, or there's something mechanically wrong with either the way the autoclave is functioning or the way in which steam is presented to the autoclave. Nonetheless, what it indicated is that those operators really did not understand the significance of this, because when you have a wet load, there is a risk of non-sterility. So these autoclave operators, all very well-intentioned, trying to do the best they could with what they had available, they had a very basic GMP compliance-based training session, many of which you would have sat through in your career at some stage. The session was largely, as we would say, chalk and talk, so the trainer doing more talking than the trainees. And one thing we need to remember, the more the tutor or trainer is talking, the less people are understanding. And it was very much a read and understand the SOP, sign off. There was mentorship of the autoclave operators by experienced operators. However, it's what we call in the UK the sit by Nelly approach. In other words, somebody who is experienced shows you the ropes. But so often what that leads to is inconsistency in practice, because you get different messages from different people. It tends to elaborate on the shortcuts. It tends to encourage bad habits. And the focus was very much on, in this case, just get the job done. So the important thing here was that when I asked the operators about what they were doing and how well educated or trained they felt they were, what was evident was that they had no context. In other words, they didn't really understand the significance of a wet load. When I asked them about the products they were manufacturing, none of them really understood the products. There was no link whatsoever with their job and the patient. And one thing is really, really important is whenever there is no context, that means there is no meaning. And when there's no meaning, there's no learning. So just remember that. Unless people are emotionally engaged in the job that they are doing, and the education program makes that link, they will learn nothing. So what I mean by context, and when we ran a training session or an education session with them afterwards, we really did emphasize, look guys, this is why what you do really matters. We emphasize their role in the manufacturing process and the fact that the drugs, the medicines they were making a real difference. And we said, look, this is where you fit in. So patients depend on you. They take your medicines based on trust, that you have done your job correctly day in and day out. And the consequences of getting this wrong for these really, really ill patients is catastrophic. We emphasize that the sterility test, and we refer to that as the test for futility, because we know it's a very insensitive test, really can't be relied upon with any level of accuracy or confidence to find non-sterile products. We said, look, this all comes down to you. And we said, look, if you were receiving this product or a member of your family were receiving this product, how would you feel if something went badly wrong? So the whole point here that in any training or education session, you've got to provide context. You've got to really make the link between what they are doing, the importance of what they're doing, emotionally to the end user. And if you're unable to do that, the message will not stick. So number one is really coming up with that creative solution to providing the context that gives the meaning that then drives the learning. So working through that 10, 20, 70 model, what did we do under the 10%? Well, we ran a 3 or 4 day exercise training course with them, some of which was in the classroom, most of which was in the autoclave area. We stood them next to the autoclave on the left-hand side. We taught them through their products and what the products were used for, the impact that they had on the patients. We illustrated how an autoclave works by using one of those sterilizer bottles. When many of you have had kids, feeding them milk very early on. Well, I can certainly remember using one of these sterilizers, and we described this as a downward air displacement autoclave because in reality that's what it is. So we used the bottle sterilizer as an illustration, simple illustration that they could all identify with, to describe the importance of loading patterns, how latent heat of vaporization occurs in the autoclave as steam is generated. So a real simple model that they could identify with. We illustrated how not to load an autoclave. So having covered the basics of the autoclave down on the right-hand side, the importance of air removal, steam penetration, heat distribution, we then showed them the autoclave chamber right in the bottom left there and said, okay, what happens here? What would go wrong here? So in this 10%, we covered the basics of sterilization. We linked it to something they could identify with, namely the bottle sterilizer. We linked it to their products, to their patients, and we immediately got them to apply that knowledge to the troubleshooting of what was a bad loading of the autoclave. Now, so often trainers say to me, Martin, it's really difficult to get a complex message. For example, the kinetics of sterilization, how bugs die, D values, F sub-zero values, Z values, all of which autoclave operators really do need to understand, not at a detailed level, but they do need to understand how bacteria die and the conditions in the autoclave that will sterilize them. And people say to me, oh, that's kind of difficult to get across. And I say, look, that's your job. As an educator, your job is to make sure the message is understood. And if somebody is looking at you in a confused way because they haven't understood what an F sub-zero value is, or a D value, or a Z value, your job is to change the method of communication so that they do understand it. So remember, communication is measured by the response that you get. If you're not getting the desired response, the understanding, if you like, your job as an educator is to change your messaging. So that was the 10%, ladies and gentlemen. And sometimes people say to me, and I guess many of you are sat there thinking, hang on, Martin, how long is, you've just said this is taking 2 to 3 days. You've said that a lot of that training was done standing around the autoclave. Well, we've got to do this in half a day or maybe an hour, or we don't have access to the autoclave because it needs to be used in manufacturing. And all of that is I understand, and I realize that is a real challenge for you, is to get time, is to get access, because resources, we all know, are finite. David Begg, one of my mentors, used to often use this phrase, which I think is wonderful: if you think education is expensive, try ignorance. And when the company where we ran this session said, well, this is going to be really, really expensive to do this, we reminded them that the cost of the rejected batches was in the region of $240,000, and they'd rejected 3 or 4 batches in the 6 months before the course. We reminded them that the cost of a rejected load, and they rejected 1 or 2 loads every week, was in the region of $1,000. We reminded them that the cost of a deviation investigation was in the region of $10,000, and they had had 3 deviation investigations. So that cost of running an education session, and as it turned out on this particular occasion it was in the region of $12,000, had to be seen in the context of the hidden costs. So, if you want to educate, it takes time, it takes effort, it takes resources, but the cost of failure is considerably higher. So often that's something that many of you will identify with. Often senior leadership don't see it with such clarity. Your job as a communicator is to make sure they do. So we conveyed the 10%. So that 10% for us was probably 4 to 5 hours in total, a mixture of the classroom followed by going into the autoclave unloading area, conveying the essential knowledge they needed to know around how bacteria died and the sterilization conditions within the autoclave. We immediately followed it up by giving them problems to solve. So this is the 20%. I can't emphasize enough the importance of doing this straight away. So as soon as we'd covered the kinetics of sterilization, as soon as we'd demonstrated how the baby sterilizer, not the baby sterilizer, it wouldn't sterilize babies, but the bottle sterilizer worked, we then gave them a temperature chart to say, well, what do you think is causing this delay in the chamber coming up to temperature? What do you think is causing this biological indicator failure? That's when we challenged the load with a strip, a blotting paper strip with bacterial spores. So we got them to immediately do troubleshooting, utilizing as their reference point the essential information that we'd covered. We got them to risk rank deviations. We got them to spot the error in loading patterns. We gave them a batch record to say, well, would you release this batch based upon this sterilization record? How would you defend yourself in a court of law if you were the QP releasing a non-sterile product being interrogated by this lawyer? And we gave them numerous problem-solving case studies. So the point I'm making, ladies and gentlemen, is that once you've conveyed essential facts, you need to really follow this up creatively using different methods, different tools and techniques to embed that knowledge. The 70%, remember, this is the bit that really does matter in conveying and embedding and making that information stickable. We got them to design a simple 6-point checklist for loading and unloading the autoclave. We got them to design a train-the-trainer session. We got them involved in deviation investigations and self-inspections. We got them to use their knowledge to simplify the autoclave unloading process. We got them involved in operational improvements in and around the autoclave. And all of this was over the following 6 to 8 months of exercises after the initial training course. We got them to go to lunch and learns where they would examine a deviation incident. They would be involved in SOP development. They would do deviation investigation of the month. And the list goes on and on and on. So the challenge I put to you is, what is your 70%? So in anything that you've trained or educated people in, I'll stop using the word training, what is your 70%? One thing I'd really like to emphasize, ladies and gentlemen, is learning from mistakes is probably the best way of learning. And look upon failure, or the term fail, as first attempt in learning. So that when a problem, a deviation incident, a wet load, batch rejects happens, the first thing you do is thank people for the opportunity of learning, because failure is by far and away one of the best ways of learning and in embedding that 70% that is so crucial. And the famous quote that I'm sure many of you will have heard from Benjamin Franklin, tell me and I forget, teach me and I remember, involve me and I learn. One thing I'd also like to emphasize in sort of bringing this short session to a close, ladies and gentlemen, is that when you're not getting the desired behavior in the workplace. It's down to a number or all of these reasons. It's either down to lack of motivation, people aren't being given have not been given the information to care enough. There is either absence of essential knowledge, the why, the task may be overcomplicated, and or it may well be failure to habituate. And on some of the sessions I've run in the past, the habit loop, the cue, the routine, the reward, I would encourage you to go back and listen to those again. The point I'm making is that when you're not getting the desired behavior in the workplace, training or education may not be the answer, because so often you can educate people, but when they go to the workplace driven by the wrong performance measures, driven by the wrong supervisory behaviors, driven by over-complexity, the SOP, no amount of training or education will change their behavior in the workplace. So whenever you're not getting the desired behavior, ask yourself, is it any of or all of these? Lack of motivation, a lack of essential knowledge, over-complexity, or that we just haven't practiced enough. Some people get really nervous about, look, Martin, we getting really, really good people is challenging, and is there not the risk of you educate people and they then leave because they can get a better deal in the company down the road? Well, I think it's summarized and answered very nicely by Sir Richard Branson. You train people well enough so they can leave. You treat them well enough so that they don't want to. And another quote that I've often used in the past, this is a conversation between the Chief Financial Officer and the CEO. The CFO asks the boss person, what happens if we invest in developing our people and they leave us? To which the response is, what happens if we don't and they stay? So I hope that has really got you to think differently about training and education, because we do need to think differently in this VUCA world, where actually we have another population, another generation that thinks very, very differently to certainly my generation. So I hope it's really given you some provocative thinking to go out and challenge your organizations and really ask the question, do we take the 10-20-70? Are we training our people for a world that no longer exists? Or are we educating our people for that VUCA world that does? So please, ladies and gentlemen, any questions, please just email me. I'm really disappointed when I don't get any questions, because I really want to be provocative, as well as giving you different tools and techniques and a way of going about, in this case, how you educate your people, because we have to make people before we make medicines. And without an educated workforce, not a trained workforce, but without an educated workforce where we utilize their full intellectual capabilities and capacities, we will not survive as a company. So I really hope you found it provocative and thought-provoking. Please share this with your colleagues. And if you do have any questions, please don't hesitate in dropping me a line. And you will receive the links to the recording, and I would really implore you to share as widely as possible in your organization. So thank you for taking the time out to listen. Hope you found it really, really useful. And I really do look forward to your questions and to your feedback. Thank you very much, and see you in October.